Previously on the show, Shaun and Leah's hiking trip turned into a life-and-death challenge, with Shaun suffering a serious ankle injury and losing sensation, relying on Leah to perform emergency treatment, and eventually escaping danger safely. At the hospital, dancer Maya faced the risk of amputation due to a rare blood disorder, and in order to keep dancing in the future, she took the risk of undergoing a high-risk surgery. But due to a severe rejection reaction, the plan failed, and her dance partner Leo had to make the painful decision to amputate her leg. Faced with the test of love and human nature, Maya chose to face her shattered future alone. Young boy Jackson fell ill after inhaling cancer cells during his mother Sarah's pregnancy, while Sarah herself was battling terminal cancer. And faced with helplessness, Shaun struggled to find a solution, ultimately finding hope through the family's reunion. Self-taught father Walt clashed fiercely with Shaun over Holly's condition, and although Shaun was once sidelined, he stood up at the critical moment and successfully saved Holly, winning the respect of both Walt and his daughter. As Shaun's billboard rose high on the hospital wall, a new chapter began. A young couple insisted on getting married in the pouring rain, but tragedy struck. Seeing this, Shaun turned and ran away, leaving his girlfriend behind to be knocked down by a falling tree. And seriously, what kind of behavior was that? Fortunately, it turned out to be just a dream of Leah's, but did it hint that their relationship would soon face new challenges? After all, Shaun was now a rising star in the medical world, surrounded by countless admirers, and more patients were coming from all over just to be treated by him, even turning the hospital into a popular check-in spot. Meanwhile, the hospital had been acquired by Salem, and late at night, instead of sleeping, Shaun was busy writing her a letter. Leah was a little worried, and when she asked, she found out that after Salem took office, she implemented cost-cutting reforms, removing paper towels and soap from the bathrooms, which Shaun simply could not tolerate. Even worse, Salem also insisted on cutting costs when treating patients. One day, the hospital admitted a car accident patient whose facial bones were shattered into pieces, but Shaun, with just one glance, found a way to fix it. However, the procedure required an expensive implant, and when Salem found out about the cost, she immediately rejected the doctor's request without hesitation. As a result, Shaun and the others had to find another way to at least save the patient's life. But after the surgery, Shaun grew increasingly frustrated, wondering whether it was truly acceptable to let a patient miss out on the best treatment and end up disabled just because of money. Various models and simulations kept flashing through Shaun's mind. Suddenly, the sound of a hand dryer interrupted his thoughts. It was another one of Salem's cost-saving measures replacing paper towels. The last string in Shaun's mind snapped, and he covered his ears and angrily banged on the hand dryer, trying to make the noise stop. Shaun went straight to Salem, demanding that she reverse her hospital reforms, presenting various data he had gathered to prove that her measures were not scientifically sound.
You made these changes without asking us first because you're not trying to help us or protect patients. You're doing it to save money, and it's wrong.
Shaun.
Facing Shaun's emotional outburst, Salem quickly tried to calm him down, claiming that everything was based on expert advice, and suggested a compromise. Salem would provide Shaun with free paper towels personally, but the rest of the reforms would stay. At that moment, Shaun thought he had defeated the capitalist giant and was absolutely thrilled. After calming down, he returned to the operating room triumphantly because he had found a new treatment plan, a method that could save the patient without using expensive implants. By building a bone bridge, they could preserve the patient's vision and chewing ability. Meanwhile, Leonard, who was frequently bullied, was hospitalized after his jaw was fractured again. At first, Leonard hesitated to explain, but luckily his daughter revealed the truth to the doctors. Before the doctors could finish expressing their concern, Leonard suddenly began breathing rapidly, likely due to the jaw fracture, and needed an emergency jaw realignment. Originally, it should have been a minor procedure, but during the surgery, Leonard's heart rate suddenly became abnormal, prompting the doctors to suspect a heart problem and schedule further tests. Surprisingly, the results showed that Leonard's heart was perfectly healthy, and he would be able to leave the hospital soon. The doctors advised him to report the bullying to the police, but Leonard refused, saying that he knew the police would not care. No sooner had he finished speaking than Leonard's blood pressure spiked, followed by a dangerous drop in his breathing rate, suggesting he was suffocating. After examination, Shaun concluded, "Your heart is fine. There's something wrong with your brain." It turned out that due to repeated beatings, Leonard's brain had developed necrosis and edema, which were now compressing his brainstem. Shaun informed Leonard that they could perform brain surgery to fix it, but it carried the risk of leaving him partially paralyzed. Of course, Leonard could also choose not to undergo surgery, but if he did, he would have at most 1 year left to live. Faced with two bad options, Leonard still chose the latter without hesitation, leaving the doctors stunned. Alex found Leonard's daughter, Emily, hoping she could persuade her father to choose life. Although Emily was heartbroken and shed tears, she ultimately respected her father's decision because she knew how stubborn he was, and she did not want to turn against him. Meanwhile, Leonard suddenly had a seizure in the ward and fell into a coma. Now Emily became the medical decision-maker, and it was up to her to decide her father's fate. To convince her, Shaun said, "This is a very wrong and very irrational decision. Whether your father hates you or not doesn't matter. What others think doesn't matter. Worrying about these things will only cause you more pain. What matters is saving your father's life." Shaun's words successfully awakened Emily, and in the end, she made the decision that saved her father's life. After the surgery, Leonard woke up and everything had been settled. Emily thought her father would never forgive her, and after a heartfelt farewell, she was about to leave the room. But Leonard called out to her, "Good thing my daughter is so tough." But at that moment, Leonard finally recalled the determination he had when he first came alone to a foreign country to build his life. His story reminds us that when people are too tolerant, they often lose even more. When the doctors saw a critically injured patient, instead of rushing to save him, they asked, "Organ donor?" But Shaun said it didn't matter because he would not let him die. It turned out that Brandon had fallen from 100 meters high with multiple fractures all over his body and had lost over 40% of his blood volume. Fortunately, Brandon's organs were still intact, and since he had made it to Shaun's hands, it meant there was still a chance for him to survive. When Alex heard about Brandon's blood type, he had a bold idea. He took it upon himself to call the mother of another patient, Ollie, a little boy who was desperately in need of a heart transplant due to a congenital heart defect. Thus, Shaun's patient was suddenly being eyed as a donor. Meanwhile, in the operating room, Shaun was trying to save Brandon while blood kept spurting from Brandon's abdomen. After they finally stopped the bleeding, the doctors discovered that Brandon's brainwave activity was extremely weak, meaning even if his physical injuries healed, he might never regain consciousness. Asher had no choice but to break the news to Brandon's father, Thomas, who was anxiously waiting outside the operating room. In this situation, no father would give up on his child. And even with only a 1 in 10,000 chance of recovery, Thomas wanted the doctors to continue treating his son. Shaun felt the same way, and he kept searching for ways to save Brandon. But then Alex approached Shaun, explaining Ollie's urgent need for a heart transplant and hoping Shaun would give up on Brandon. Shaun angrily kicked Alex out. After Alex left, Shaun quickly came up with a solution. They could use a stent to increase blood flow to the upper brain and restore Brandon's consciousness. The surgery was carried out following Shaun's plan, but an accident still occurred. The doctors found that Brandon's blood vessels had formed clots around the stent, and the surgery came to a standstill once again. Shaun had to deliver the heartbreaking news to Thomas. The 1 in 10,000 chance was gone, and Brandon's only outcome would now be brain death. Shaun then told Thomas that there was a little boy in the hospital waiting for a heart transplant, and if they agreed, Brandon's heart could save another life. How could Thomas possibly accept that? He still had so much he wanted to say to his son after he woke up. With Asher's encouragement, Thomas finally sat beside Brandon's bed, reminiscing about their memories together, and could no longer hold back his grief as he gently kissed his son's forehead for a final farewell. "I love you, son." The transplant surgery began, and Shaun carefully removed Brandon's vibrant heart, while Alex placed it into Ollie's chest. Ollie woke up, and his illness was cured. Alex placed a stethoscope on Ollie, letting him listen to the heartbeat, the source of his new life, and the symbol of someone else's selfless gift. Meanwhile, Shaun handed Thomas a list detailing where each of Brandon's organs had gone. A single mother received his kidney, a truck driver received his cornea, a young baseball player received his ligament. There were a total of 63 names on the list. Brandon had saved 63 families. At last, Thomas took the list and tucked it behind his son's photo, because the legacy his son left behind was something to be proud of forever. Nira originally came to the hospital for a routine eye check, but unexpectedly, a tumor was discovered, and even if it were removed, there was a risk of blindness. Morgan initially found a way that could fully restore Nira's vision, but Salen demanded that Morgan aim to restore only 60% of her vision. It turned out that Nira was a health insurance executive, a valuable client for the hospital, and securing her meant potentially gaining 3,000 new customers. From the beginning, Salen told Morgan that if she could lock down this client, she would receive a promotion and a raise. At first, Morgan worked diligently to find the best treatment plan. Because Nira had an optic nerve tumor, it could not be directly removed. To prevent Nira from going blind, Alex suggested using an endonasal endoscopy method to avoid the blood vessels and clear the tumor, ultimately preserving 60% of her vision. But considering that it was related to her promotion, Morgan thought it would be best to find a way to preserve all of Nira's vision. Soon, she found an innovative therapy in a medical paper, proton beam radiation therapy using a synchrotron. Everything about this method was ideal, except that the hospital had not purchased the necessary machine. So Morgan had to go to the hospital director to request support for the equipment. Salen initially supported Morgan's decision, but then suddenly changed her tone and said, "Reasonable medical decision, bad business decision." It turned out that the cost of the equipment exceeded the contract's value by several $100,000, and compared to restoring 100% of Neera's vision, restoring only 60% was obviously a more cost-effective option. Morgan understood Salen's meaning, but at the same time, patients had the right to know what treatments they could choose, and if she told Neera everything they had discussed, the deal would surely fall through. In the end, Morgan chose to keep her conscience hidden and only mentioned the treatment that would restore 60% of Neera's vision, and Neera, unaware of the truth, wept with gratitude. She had no idea about the shady dealings behind the scenes. The surgery ended successfully, but the complexity of the tumor exceeded Morgan's expectations, and Neera ultimately only regained 50% of her vision. Even so, Neera was still deeply grateful to the doctor standing before her, treating Morgan like a savior. Afterwards, Morgan gained fame and a raise, Salen secured the contract, and the patient regained some of her sight. Everyone seemed to have a bright future ahead. But with Salen gradually turning the hospital into her puppet, could she really continue running unchecked? Who would be able to stop her in the end? To please Salen, Marcus took on a high-profile case and assigned Shaun and Jordan to assist in a high-risk surgery for famous pop singer Nelly. It turned out that Nelly, after singing for 30 hours a day without properly protecting her voice, had completely ruined her throat. In order to return to the stage, she decided to undergo a throat transplant surgery. But when Shaun examined Nelly, he noticed an abnormality in her left carotid artery and warned Marcus that forcing the surgery could result in massive bleeding and death. However, Marcus was unusually confident and had no intention of listening to Shaun's concerns. Soon after, tests confirmed that Shaun's suspicion was correct. Yet Marcus still ignored the warnings and insisted on proceeding with the surgery for Nelly, simply because the hospital saw her fame as a potential goldmine. The increased difficulty of the surgery was even considered a bonus because completing it would bring the hospital enormous profits. But Shaun never supported this reckless behavior. As for him, a patient's life was far more important than the hospital's interests. During the simulated surgery sessions, Shaun kept complaining about the new hospital policies and Marcus's obsession with profit. It took 9 full simulations before they finally succeeded once. However, before the actual surgery could begin, an alarm went off in Nelly's hospital room. It turned out that the preoperative immunosuppressive therapy had failed, meaning Nelly was likely to reject the transplanted organ. Shaun warned Marcus again, telling him that this was destined to be a failed surgery. But Marcus remained overly confident, saying they could inject donor bone marrow stem cells to prevent rejection. However, this would also greatly increase Nelly's risk of infection. Hearing Marcus's response made Shaun extremely disappointed. The surgery proceeded anyway. Shaun first injected stem cells into Nelly through a catheter, while Marcus was responsible for transplanting the trachea. Unknowingly, 8 hours had passed, and the surgery was almost complete. But then, an accident happened. Nelly's throat started bleeding profusely, and her vital signs plummeted. It turned out that the trachea had caused a coagulation disorder, and Marcus could only keep ordering more blood transfusions to replace what was lost. Yet Nelly's blood pressure kept dropping, nearing a flatline. Marcus began performing CPR while Shaun stood to the side, voicing his frustrations. As the heart monitor flatlined and the harsh alarm blared, it seemed that Nelly was beyond saving, but Marcus kept performing CPR until the other doctors reminded him it was over, and only then did he finally stop and look helplessly toward Salen upstairs. At that moment, they finally began to panic. However, just as the doctors were about to pronounce time of death, the heart monitor flickered back to life, and the bleeding miraculously stopped. A short while later, all of Nelly's vitals stabilized, meaning she had survived against all odds. What had happened? None of the doctors could figure it out, except Shaun, who realized that Nelly had a rare blood clotting factor. If it had been anyone else, they would have died, but Nelly was incredibly lucky. Unfortunately, this lucky outcome only emboldened Salen further, making it likely that more people would fall under her control and more unfortunate patients would become sacrifices for her growing empire. Ryan came to the hospital for an examination because of his golden-colored eyes. He had traveled across the country looking for answers but found none, so he came seeking Shaun's help. Shaun immediately arranged for Ryan to undergo tests. They started with a brain scan, but sadly, no tumors or intracranial bleeding were found. However, just then, Ryan suddenly suffered a seizure, and Shaun had no choice but to suspend the examinations. However, that night, while making rounds, Shaun noticed that Ryan kept scratching his neck and said that his back was very itchy. Shaun quickly unbuttoned Ryan's shirt, only to find a large area of rash spreading across his back. Shaun immediately realized that this was a sign of immune deficiency. He administered medication to Ryan, but soon after, Ryan developed nausea and abdominal pain, and his eyes turned even more yellow. Shaun believed that Ryan's unfinished full-body examination could no longer be delayed. Not only that, he instructed Ryan's friend Dom to undergo testing as well. Soon, Shaun finally reached a conclusion: liver cancer. It turned out that 8 months ago, Ryan had received a liver transplant from Dom. But what they never expected was that the liver already carried cancer cells, and the doctors at the time failed to detect it. The reason Ryan had golden eyes was also because the cancer cells had attacked his immune system. This meant that the cancer had already spread throughout his body, and even if they removed his liver now, Ryan would only have a few months left to live. In contrast, Dom was lucky because the cancer cells had transferred to Ryan. But this ending made Dom feel extremely guilty. "I thought I was saving you, but instead, I caused you even more pain." However, Ryan had already come to terms with it. Without that liver, he would not have lived much longer anyway. And now he had gained 8 more months and even saved his friend, which meant he had won twice, so what more could he ask for? In the end, he only hoped that Dom would take care of his wife and children for him. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the hospital, Asher and Jordan were performing a checkup on a pregnant woman. Grace said that this was her 6th pregnancy. It turned out the baby inside her was not her own, as she was a professional surrogate mother, and the woman accompanying her, Amanda, was her client, and they were at the hospital because there was something wrong with her pregnancy. After running tests, they found that Grace had developed a bladder tumor. But the problem was, if they removed the tumor, they would have to terminate the pregnancy. Unless Grace was willing to undergo chemotherapy, but chemotherapy would be even more painful for her, and there was still a chance that the cancer cells could spread. Amanda couldn't bear to ask Grace to take that risk, but Grace said, "I want to do the chemo." Everyone found it hard to understand why Grace would make such a choice for someone else's child. However, even though Grace was so selfless, an accident still happened. The doctors discovered that Grace's blood vessels had ruptured, requiring surgical intervention, with a 50% chance of causing a miscarriage. The doctors did everything they could, attempting to repair the blood vessels through a minimally invasive procedure. But during the surgery, another complication arose. Grace's uterus started bleeding heavily, and her blood pressure kept dropping. At this point, the doctors had no choice but to perform a C-section to repair the uterine bleeding. But how could they protect the baby? Then, the doctors came up with the idea of suturing the placenta, which would stabilize the injury and create a protective shield for the baby. The method was feasible, and with joint efforts, the doctors successfully completed the surgery. So, what kinds of cases will they encounter in the next episode? Let's look forward to it.